Sunday. What we looked at on Sunday was the story of Jesus' confrontation with the Pharisees over the disciples picking some grain. And we had a look at that story from the book of Luke. But the story can also be found in the Gospel of Matthew and in the Gospel of Mark. And each one of the accounts has a different emphasis. My argument on Sunday was that Luke's main emphasis was Christ, what we call a Christological emphasis. It was all about Christ and Christ's lordship. And this time we're going to look at Mark, which I think has a slightly more man-focused account, just in terms of what details he chooses to include. It's not absolutely one way or the other. So we'll begin by having a look at Mark chapter 2, 786 in the church Bibles, starting in verse 23. And you'll note the similarities and differences between the two versions as we go through. Oh, is it on now? I've just moved it. Verse 23. Okay. One Sabbath, he was going through the grainfields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him? And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." So you can see there, very similar passages. I'm not going to exposit all of Mark, because we've just done it in Luke. And we can see what's similar. We can see that Mark picks out a couple of different details about which time of which priest it was. And then we come to the line that I think really stands out in the Mark passage, that I think is really, really helpful for our understanding of the Sabbath. I think if there was one verse I was going to go to talk about the Christian understanding of the Sabbath, I think it starts with this verse. I think there's a lot in it. And that would be verse 27, when Jesus says to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And then it follows, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, which is what we focused on Sunday. So the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. My objective this evening is to try and prime our conversation and answer some of the questions that you might have about Sabbathing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rattle through some issues around Sabbathing. Hopefully this will begin to help you formulate your view of the topic if you don't have one already. And what I will also do is I will lay out my current understanding of Sabbathing so that you at least know where I'm coming from. So that's where we're going. So, the main question off the back of Sunday, having established that Sabbathing was something that the people of God did, that Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath, the question remains, the first question I'm going to try and answer for us is the Sabbath for the Christian? Or practically speaking, should we, as Christians, Sabbath? And my first thought when trying to answer that question is, well, Jesus said, the Sabbath was made for man. The Sabbath was made for man. That's that first part of what Jesus is saying when he says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And where that makes me immediately go is the Sabbath is a gift. It's made for us. Makes me think, well, God wants to give me something. He's made something for me. I want to have it. The second part of that sentence, that little, not even sentence, that phrase, that sentence made for man, is a further indication to me that the Sabbath was instituted at creation for man, not just the people of Israel. A gift in perpetuity. Perhaps even more shockingly, Jesus then says, not man for the Sabbath. And there's a lot we could unpack there. It immediately strikes me as very, very countercultural to say, man, woman, your life is not about your Sabbath. It's not about your day off. We're very focused on our leisure as a culture. Many people's lives revolve around, well, what am I going to do this evening? Or what am I going to do this weekend? I know lots of people that live for the weekend. And the second part of what Jesus points out to us is that, Sabbath is a gift, it's key, it's potentially a necessity. We'll have a think about that. But our whole lives do not revolve around our Sabbath. Whatever you conclude mankind's aim should be, it's not your day off. Your main aim is not living for your day off. If you are building your life around the weekend, or even worse, working really, really hard so you can have a great big long Sabbath when you retire, then I think you're misorientating your life. I'm not saying that people can't retire. I'm saying people can't slow down when they get older. But if that's what your whole life's about and building towards, then I think you're probably making your life, you're going to be a man for the Sabbath, rather than treating it as something that enables you to do what you're really supposed to be doing. Your rest is to serve you and your work, not the other way around. We see that in Genesis, man was made to do a job. We haven't got time to explore work, what our work might be as Christians. But whatever our work is, our Sabbath needs to serve that, not the other way around. Now, I could spend all evening on that verse, but I'm going to move on. So I don't think it's very difficult to say that men and women should rest, have a Sabbath. But how the Christian interacts with the Jewish Sabbath, as laid out in the Old Testament, that's a bit trickier. Here's my take on it. If we trace the history of the Sabbath from creation, which I think is where Exodus points us to, then we should expect, and Christians generally believe, that the ancestors of Adam and Eve carried with them the earliest stories, passing them on generation to generation until Moses heard them and recorded them for us. And so I do believe that the ancestors of Abraham would have been familiar with Genesis 1 and 2. God never commands in Genesis, I'm taking a break on day 7, therefore you must. However, I do think the final day of creation is recorded for us for 2 reasons. One, because I think it establishes the week as the main format for most of human history. And in fact, if you look at historically at occasions when people have tried to change the length of the week, it has not gone well. And I think the second implication of God taking as a rest is that man should do it too. Every 6 days, men and women should take a break. So before we get to the enshrinement of the Sabbath law in the Sabbath, I believe that God-fearers between Adam and Moses would have practiced a day off at the end of each week. When we see in Exodus it says observe the Sabbath, there is a sense in which this is a cultural practice that's being locked into the law. I personally think you've got to be very, very careful. I think it's verging on blasphemous. But I don't make a hard rule about it, but I think it's verging on blasphemous for any human being to say, I can work more days than God. I can keep going. God took a rest after 6 days, but I can do 10 in a row. And I know human beings are capable of doing 10 in a row. But I think we have to be very, very careful when we have that clear and obvious example on page 1 of our Bibles that then is so emphasized over and over and over again in Scripture that if we are choosing to skip a day off after 6 days of working, that we're not hubristically saying, don't worry, God, I can work harder than you. So as we see, in my view, coming from Genesis, we get to Exodus, and we see the Sabbath enshrined into national law. And we read some of those passages on Sunday, and I've got them in the notes because I realised there was quite a lot of references on Sunday. And there are more Sabbath laws that you could read. And it was defined in the law, and that does help us understand more what God was on about when we read the law. And I will refer to this, the Israelite Sabbath, as the Sabbath. The Sabbath. Later I'll look at what a Sabbath is, but when we're talking about the Sabbath that the people of Israel took part in, I'm going to refer to that as the Sabbath. The Sabbath of the people of God was not just a rest day at the end of the week. It was many things to the Israelites. It was both an institution and it was a sign for the people of Israel. And one of the reasons I don't think that Christians keep the Sabbath is because we no longer have it as a Christian institution and because it's no longer a sign of our new covenant relationship with God. Let me go through those two differences quickly. The institution of the Sabbath for the people of God in Israel was on a Saturday. Everyone had to have their Sabbath on a Saturday, and they all had to partake of it on the same day. This was enforced by the theocratic authorities, your elders, the priests, and eventually the kings and the judges. As Christians, we generally, throughout Christian history, have no civil authorities. We certainly don't have any civil authorities in the church. I don't have powers as a pastor, or me and Mick as elders cannot go around killing people and executing them for not keeping the Sabbath. It's not how things work anymore. For the Christian, the civil authority remains in the hands of the state, and elders only carry authority within the church on matters relating to spiritual things. And so the institution of the Sabbath, everyone doing it all on the same day, enforced by the state, that's gone. Christian civil authorities have tried to reintroduce it in times past, but in our particular society right now, the institution of the Sabbath is long dead, and there's certainly no institutional enforcement mechanism. So the institution has gone. It's left to the individual Christian, under grace, not the law, to determine whether or not they will Sabbath. I can't make you, neither can the government. If we do Sabbath, we do not under the compulsion of the law, but under grace, choosing to receive the gift that our Lord Jesus Christ has graciously given us. The second difference I would draw out is that as Christians, we do not have the Sabbath as one of our covenantal signs. We looked at Exodus 31 on Sunday. I'll just quote a brief part of it. And the Lord said to Moses, "You are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you. For this is a sign between me and you, that I may sanctify you." In this sense, the Sabbath is part of the ceremonial law, so far as it was an indicator to the other peoples of the world that Israel was set apart, that Israel was holy. One means by sanctify in the context of Exodus. As Christians, we are not set apart from the world in that way. We are in the nations of the world. There is no holy Israelite nation anymore. We're part of, in this country, in the United Kingdom. We're not set apart in the same way. Our sanctification begins at the cross, not because we observe the Sabbath. Our new covenant sign is baptism. That's how people know we're believers. Not because of the days off we take, because we don't all take the same day off together. It's not a sign for us anymore. So for those two reasons, and I think there are others, but for those two reasons, I feel that the Christian does not keep the Sabbath anymore. I don't think it's actually a possible option for the Christian. But I do believe that Christians should keep a Sabbath. Because I believe the day of rest instituted in Genesis was made for us and is still a necessary part of our existence, even if we cannot maintain the same institutional signposting that was available under the Old Covenant. So my view is that Christians should have a Sabbath, but they are not obliged to keep the Sabbath. There's one further issue of difference between the Israelite Sabbath and the Christian Sabbath I'd like to quickly address. Many Christians take the view, they accept all of this, and they take the view, however, that the Sabbath has moved to the first day of the week. They take the view that the Sabbath has moved to the Lord's Day. In brief, I don't take this view. I do believe that Christians in the New Testament observed the day of the resurrection, which is 3 days after Friday, in the Jewish calendar, which is the first day of the week, which is the Lord's Day, and I do believe they definitely gathered on that day. But I can't see any hard evidence that the Sabbath moved from within the New Testament. I can't see any evidence that the day of rest moved with the Christians deciding to meet on a Sunday. In fact, I think it's more likely, based on New Testament's accounts, that most Jewish converts, particularly in Israel, observed the Sabbath on the Saturday, went to temple, evangelized or studied the scriptures at temple, and then met with other Christians on a Sunday. Particularly seeing as the Sabbath was still a big part of Israelite life, I think that's probably what is more likely to have happened. I can't say for certain whether the early church treated the Sunday as a Sabbath or not, but there's no biblical data that would make me think, no, it's definitely moved. The apostles don't speak to it. But I believe, you could ask me more about that later if you want to, but I believe that because we're no longer under the law, we have the freedom to choose when we Sabbath, provided we don't work more than 6 days. If you take a day off after day 7, it's a day off, but I don't think you can call it a Sabbath anymore. Now, this is a useful position for me, because I work on the Lord's Day, and if I didn't get a day off on a Monday, I think I'd struggle. So it's a position that suits me quite well. To my mind, you have the freedom to observe the Sabbath on a Saturday, is traditional home. Observe the Sabbath on the Sunday, if you want to observe it on the Lord's Day. Or you can observe the Sabbath on another day, particularly if you work in nursing and you've got to work some weekends or in retail. If you need to take a day of rest on a Wednesday, I think that's permissible in the New Testament sense. Now, I think the issue of gathering with other believers on a Sunday, that's a separate issue. You've got an objective to rest and an objective to gather. How you meet those objectives is for you to wrestle through and work out. Now, in encouraging everyone to have a Sabbath, and I am encouraging everyone to have a Sabbath, I must immediately put in a reminder for those who don't need to be encouraged to rest. Remember that Jesus said that man was not made for a Sabbath. We have a pattern of work, both God's pattern of work and Israel's pattern of work, which is 6 long days, and then a Sabbath. So I would encourage you, particularly if you're someone who's tempted towards being the sluggard that we looked at last week in Proverbs, that if you're able, you should work towards considering 6 days of your week as working days and the 7th as a rest day. Now, caveat on top of a caveat, we now live in a world where work and home is really separated. Most of us don't work from home. Some of us do now, but our work isn't based around our home, and so we go and do paid employment. I'm not saying that we need to do paid employment 6 days in a week. We all have work to do on our houses, serving the church, attending to various other responsibilities. What I'm suggesting is that Christians should seek to attend to all of their responsibilities across 6 days and then draw a line under them after 6 days and take a rest. That's a target. It's not an absolute rule. It's something that people need to, if that's not where you're at, it's something to work towards, not immediately shift to. But that's the biblical model that we have for work and rest. Does raise the question of how many hours should I work in a day? On the Sabbath, none. I don't think you should work any hours on the Sabbath. For the rest of the week, again, that's left for you to work out. All I would say is that when the Bible was written, you could only really work during daylight hours and not during the heat of the summer, during the heat of the sun during the summer either. So that might be a helpful thing to think about when it's deciding, particularly if you're self-employed, when do I call it a day? The question remains, and comes back to what the Pharisees were asking about, what actually constitutes work? Was picking grain work? We looked at how the Pharisees were wrong to ask that question, but for us as Christians, how do we work out what's our work, what we should do on a Sabbath, what we shouldn't do on Sabbath? If you'd like to have a quick look at Exodus 16, it's page 54 in the church Bibles. We're not going to read all of it. I'm going to kind of skip through, but you can be looking at it with me. So at this point, the people of God are in the desert. They've had their Sabbath law handed to them. And then they have their, this is kind of the first training opportunity for the people of God. So starting in verse 4, I'll skip through. So reading verse 4 and 5. So they're hungry in the desert, and the Lord's about to provide for them. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. On the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily." So that's the Lord's opening instruction. We skip over to verse 16. "This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather of it, each one of you, as much as he can eat. He shall each take an omer, according to the number of persons that each of you has in his tent." And the people of Israel did so. They gathered, some more, some less. But when they measured it out with an omer, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. Each of them gathered as much as he could eat. And Moses said to them, "Let no one leave any of it over till the morning." And then looking at verse 21. "Morning by morning they gathered it, each as much as he could eat. But when the sun grew hot, it melted. On the 6th day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each. And when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, 'This is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept till the morning.' So they laid it aside till the morning as Moses commanded them, and it did not stink, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, 'Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will find it in the field. You will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th, which is a Sabbath, there will be none.' And on the 7th day some of the people went to gather, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, 'How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, the Lord has given you a Sabbath. Therefore, on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Remain each one of you in his place. Let no one go out of his place on the 7th day.' So the people rested on the 7th day." So you can see, even in its earliest conception, the people of God really struggling to keep the Sabbath. Most of human history, this was really simple. If you were out in the field, you were working, and if you stayed home, you were resting. In our day, it's much more difficult to make rules as to what counts as work and what doesn't. And again, I'm not going to try and set a set of rules for you to abide by, but I would encourage you to determine what is my rest by this principle. Whatever you do for work at home or in employment, don't do it on your Sabbath. If you spend your week going and collecting manna, when it comes to your Sabbath, don't. You all right there, Stephen, Kathy? Just going to turn them down for a second. So if it's what you do during the week, you don't do it on your day off. That's the principle. If you spend all week doing heavy manual labour, stay home and sit. Lie down. Don't do physical exercise on your day off if that's what you do during the week. If you sit at a computer all week, however, it'd be a really good idea on your day off to go out and get some exercise. That would be your rest. That would be your Sabbath. That would be your break from work. If you spend all your spare moments serving church, which is great, stop serving the church on your day off. If, on the other hand, you can only serve the church on your day off and you spend the rest of your week not serving the church, maybe serving the church will be your rest. These are all things we have to work out in our own lives. If you're lucky enough to enjoy your job, this is a very hard discipline to maintain. If your tendency is towards being a workaholic, then taking a day off is very hard and certainly not enjoyable. And I would point out that the general concept of that we should enjoy our rest, that we should enjoy our Sabbath, is relatively new historically and culturally. The idea of leisure is a relatively new one. I'm not saying we're not allowed to enjoy our days off, but entertainment is not the primary goal of our rest, our God-focused rest. Entertainment can be part of how we spend our day off, but that shouldn't be our first thought. Our first thought should be, how can I rest from work? How can I rest in God? Like we looked at on Sunday. As a general rule, as I say, we have freedom to work these things out. And as I said on Sunday, sometimes we need to work on how we have our days off. We need to work on our habits. We need to work on our disciplines. And we have to be disciplined in keeping our day off a day off. 2 quick final considerations. The hardest thing to achieve, I found, trying to practically apply this, is to achieve it for the stay-at-home mum and homemaker. Trying to get a Sabbath for mum, particularly when you've got young children, although I'm sure it's difficult when you've got teenagers. I think it's the hardest spiritual discipline to achieve from mum's perspective and from dad's perspective to help mum achieve it. For most men, the boundaries between work and rest are clear, and it's easier for them to have a Sabbath. It's very difficult for mum to determine what is my break, what would it even look like if I got a break. And it's very difficult for mum and dad to get a Sabbath on the same day. I would encourage husbands and prospective husbands, you must consider, how will I release my wife from her work as a mother and a homemaker so that she can Sabbath? Wives and mothers, most of them have accepted in conversation that being mum is a full-time job. Set 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I get that. And it's impossible to turn that mum part of the brain off to a certain extent, and I get that too. But find a way with your husband of having a day off once a week. Very hard to achieve, but worth fighting for. We all got to consider as well, in an age where single motherhood, for whatever reason, is more and more common, as we have single mothers coming to the church, how do we help them get a rest? A difficult question to answer. The details are up to you. Final consideration. As your pastor, or as for me and Mick as elders, we're not here to enforce or dictate to you how much work you should do and how much you should rest. What you should do on your rest time, what you should do on work time. All I can say with surety today is you should work and you should rest. The details are up to you. And if you take the view that the Sabbath has no place in the Christian life, you're very welcome at this church. You can completely disagree with me on this one. But I've got one big caveat. If you come to me or to Mick and you're burnt out and you're highly anxious and you're terribly worried and you're surrounded with the symptoms that look like you might be overworked, the first thing I'm going to say to you is take a day off. And it's going to be very difficult to help you from a pastor's perspective unless you start by doing that. You'll have my sympathy, my prayers, but do not expect to spurn the gifts of the Lord of the Sabbath and not suffer unduly. Take on a suffering that you shouldn't have to suffer. Now, there are exceptions to our Sabbath practice. Even if you take all of this on board, there are exceptions to these principles. And that's what we're going to be looking at on Sunday when we come to our next Luke passage. What do we do when someone's ill and in front of us? What do we do when someone's suffering? And there's much more that could be said.